This Sultai deck focuses on casting X spells for the purposes of creating a value engine that rapidly advances our board state. There are dozens of X spells inundating the 99 in order to trigger our general's ability as frequently as possible. Combat is our preferred path to victory, but we also can claim victory through life drain, direct damage, and or forcing our opponents to draw cards from empty libraries. Zaxara the Exemplary debuted as a commander option in the 99 of the Enhanced Evolution pre-constructed EDH deck from the Ikoria Layer of Behemoths 2020 commander product. Zaxara is a 2/3 Nightmare Hydra with Death Touch for 1 in Sultai colors. That's 1 black, 1 green, and 1 blue mana. We can tap Zaxara to add 2 mana of any one color to our mana pool. Whenever we cast a spell with X in its mana cost, we create a 0/0 green Hydra creature token and then put X +1/+1 counters on it. In addition to optimizing the creation of these Hydra creature tokens and their dispersal of their +1/+1 counters, the 99 of this build also has been sculpted to take advantage of Zaxara's X spell synergy. Through this Zaxara-led engine, we will easily out-tempo and overwhelm our opponents on the path to imminent victory. We begin the 99 of this deck tech by showcasing the lands. We have a somewhat balanced land base that tips slightly towards green, which is understandable since green is the predominant color featured throughout this build. With color fixing in mind, our basic lands are limited to 2 swamps, 2 forests, and 2 islands for a total of 6 basic lands. For the purposes of promoting balance, we have the appropriate dual-colored lands from various land cycles. Overgrown Tomb, Breeding Pool, and Watery Grave are our shock lands. They have 2 basic land types, enter the battlefield tapped unless we pay 2 life, and they tap to add 1 of 2 different colors of mana. Undergrowth Stadium, Rejuvenating Springs, and Morphic Pool are our fan lands. They enter the battlefield tapped unless we have at least 2 opponents, and they tap to add 1 of 2 different colors of mana. Deathcap Glade, Dreamroot Cascade, and Shipwreck Marsh are our slow lands. They enter the battlefield tapped unless we control at least 2 other lands, and they tap to add 1 of 2 different colors of mana. Woodland Cemetery, Hinterland Harbor, and Drowned Catacomb are our check lands. They enter the battlefield tapped unless we have 1 of 2 specific land types, and they tap to add 1 of 2 different colors of mana. Although they do not necessarily fix our mana, pathways provide us the option of playing one side of the land or the other. This promotes immediate color fixing, but we lose the versatility of relying on these lands to provide 1 of 2 different colors of mana throughout the game. Even so, they are worthy of inclusion here. It's either Darkboar Pathway or Slitherboar Pathway. It's either Bark Channel Pathway or Tide Channel Pathway. And it's either Clearwater Pathway or Murkwater Pathway. Branching out from our dual-colored lands to more versatile options is Command Tower, which is the best land in our format. It taps to add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity. Reflecting Pool should easily act as Command Tower version 2.0, and Exotic Orchard has a good chance to be Command Tower version 3.0, at least temporarily, of course. It taps to add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. Mana Confluence taps to add 1 mana of any color, but we must pay 1 life each time we activate it. Zagoth Triome has 3 different land types, enters the battlefield tapped, and can tap to add a black, green, or blue mana. We also could pay 3 and cycle this card away from our hand in order to draw a card. In order to assist with our process of smoothing out our mana base, we also have the appropriate fetch lands in Verdant Catacombs, Misty Rainforest, and Polluted Delta. We can tap these lands, pay 1 life, and search our library for a land card with one of 2 different basic land types and put it onto the battlefield. These lands can fetch out our basics, shocks, and our #1 target, Zagoth Triome. Next, we have a couple of lands that can produce oodles of green mana in Castle Garenbrig and Gaia's Cradle. Castle Garenbrig enters the battlefield tapped unless we control a forest. It taps to add a green mana, or we can pay 2 and 2 green mana and tap it to add 6 green mana. But we can only spend this mana to cast creature spells. We can tap Gaia's Cradle to add a green mana to our mana pool for each creature we control. These lands help to create and maintain tempo by advancing our board states well past our opponents. We have a few utility lands left to review before we close out this section of the deck tech. Reliquary Tower gives us no maximum hand size. As we will showcase later, this deck has numerous card draw spells, and we want to keep these cards in our hand and not have to discard down to 7 at the end of our turn. Cards in hand equals problems for opponents. We can pay 4 and tap Rogue's Passage to make target creature unblockable until end of turn. We also can pay 4 mana and tap Karn's Bastion to proliferate. When we proliferate, we choose any number of permanents and or players, and then we give each of them another counter of each kind already there. Lastly, we have Alchemist's Refuge. We can pay a green and a blue mana, tap it, and cast spells this turn as though they had flash. Our opponents must heighten their awareness to the possible spell-slinging shenanigans this land can offer. The bigger our X spells are, the bigger impact they will have on the game. With that in mind, we have an abundance of mana ramp spells and effects for the purposes of maximizing the X cost of our spells. We begin with the usual suspects of Mana Crypt and Soul Ring. Each taps for 2 colorless mana and are some of the most powerful artifacts in the game. Note that Mana Crypt has a coin-flipping upkeep trigger that deals 3 points of damage to us if we lose the flip. Next up is Thought Vessel, which is an artifact version of Reliquary Tower. Redundancy is our friend here when it comes to keeping cards in excess of 7 in our hand and out of our graveyard. Arcane Signet taps to add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity and may be the best 2 CMC mana rock in the format. Elementalist's Palette taps to add 1 mana of any color. Whenever we cast a spell with X in its mana cost, we put 2 charge counters onto this artifact. We can tap to add a colorless mana for each charge counter on Elementalist's Palette. We can spend this mana only on costs that contain X. Wow. Just wow. We get the traditional 1 mana of any color for a 3 CMC mana rock, but the synergies with X spells makes this an inordinately valuable source of X cost boosting. Elementalist's Palette is one of the most powerful cards in this deck. We have a slew of land ramp spells in this build as well. Kodama's Reach and Cultivate have us search our library for 2 basic lands, reveal them, and put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into our hand. Both Nature's Lore and 3 Visits allow us to search our library for a forest card and put it onto the battlefield. Farseek has us search for a plains, island, swamp, or mountain card and put it into play tapped. Note that these sources do not require us to search for a basic land, meaning that our shock lands and Zagoth Triome also can be put onto the battlefield with these spells. In addition to our general, we have a couple of other creatures in the 99 that can tap to add mana in the forms of Bloom Tender and Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Bloom Tender adds 1 mana for each color among permanents we control. This elf druid provides a range of mana production between 1 and 3 mana, which is more than enough to justify its inclusion here, especially considering that it only has a mana value of 1 and 1 green mana. We can pay a green mana and tap Selvala to add X mana in any combination of colors, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. Also, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power. With our penchant for putting biggins onto our side of the battlefield, Selvala becomes invaluable secondary to mana production and peripheral card drawing effects, and is considered one of the most powerful cards in this build. Closing out the mana ramp section of this deck tech is Growing Rites of Itlamok. When this enchantment enters the battlefield, we look at the top 4 cards of our library. We may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into our hand, and then we put the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. The odds are not in our favor of revealing a creature card here, but that's okay. Growing Rites is in this deck for what it becomes, not for what it does when it enters the battlefield. At the beginning of our end step, if we control at least 4 creatures, then Growing Rites of Itlamok transforms into Itlamok, Cradle of the Sun. We can tap this legendary land to add a green mana, or we can tap it to add a green mana for each creature we control. Note that Itlamok is a better version of Gaia's Cradle. We just have to jump through a hoop to make it happen. The majority of our removal and disruption spells come from our X spells. However, we would be remiss if we did not include some additional versatile and powerful options for the purposes of better managing our opponent's sides of the battlefield. Assassin's Trophy destroys target permanent an opponent controls. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield. Beast Within destroys target non-land permanent, and its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. We will gladly trade a 3/3 creature token for an opponent's problematic permanent. For mass disruption, if we pay the overload cost of Cyclonic Rift, then we return each non-land permanent we don't control to their owner's hands. Now it's time to reveal our instant and sorcery X spells. Let's begin with every Magic player's favorite part of the game, drawing cards. Both Blue Sun Zenith and Stroke of Genius have target player draw X cards. Note that Blue Sun Zenith is shuffled into our library upon resolution. Also note that these spells have target player draw X cards, so the targets do not have to be us. If we generate enough mana, then we can target an opponent with one of these spells for the purposes of having them draw cards from an empty library. Remember, when a player draws cards from an empty library, they lose the game. Perhaps our opponents will not enjoy drawing cards as much anymore. Pull from Tomorrow has us draw X cards and then we discard a card. Finale of Revelation has us draw X cards, but if X is 10 or more, then instead we shuffle our graveyard into our library, draw X cards, untap up to 5 lands, and we have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. We also exile Finale of Revelation. This could, in effect, provide the semblance of a second turn, particularly if we untap Gaia's Cradle or Itlamok Cradle of Growth with a battlefield teeming with creatures. For some card advantage benefits, Wildest Dreams returns X cards from our graveyard to our hand, and then we exile Wildest Dreams. Note that this sorcery has XX as part of its mana value, which means that we must pay X twice. Thassa's Intervention provides 2 options from which to choose. Either we look at the top X cards of our library and put up to 2 of them into our hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order, or we counter target spell unless its controller pays twice X. For some spot removal options, we have Erebus's Intervention and Profane Command. Both are modal spells with very relevant options from which to choose. Erebus's Intervention gives target creature -X until end of turn, and we gain X life, or we exile up to twice X target cards from graveyards. With the amount of mana we can generate in this deck, this instant's second option, in effect, could result in exiling our opponent's entire graveyards. Profane Command has 4 different modes, and we can choose 2 of them. Target player loses X life. We return target creature card with mana value X or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. Target creature gets -X until end of turn, or up to X target creatures gain fear until end of turn, which means that they cannot be blocked except by artifact and or black creatures. Note that with enough mana and a sufficient number of creatures on our side of the battlefield, Profane Command could be a win condition by choosing to have target player lose X life and giving fear to up to X of our creatures. For some mass removal options, we have Curse of the Swine and Black Sun's Zenith. Curse of the Swine exiles X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller creates a 2/2 green boar creature token. Black Sun Zenith puts X -1/-1 counters on each creature, and then we shuffle it into our library upon resolution. Note that Black Sun Zenith will put -1/-1 counters on our creatures as well. Also note that if Zaxara is on our side of the battlefield when we cast this spell, the Hydra token will be created before Black Sun Zenith resolves, meaning that it, too, will get X -1/-1 counters. And now for some potentially game-winning X options, we have Open into Wonder and Villainous Wealth. For Open into Wonder, X target creatures cannot be blocked this turn. Until end of turn, these creatures also have, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card. Our creatures should be both wide and tall. Giving them unblockability makes winning even easier for us. With Villainous Wealth, target opponent exiles the top X cards of their library. We may cast any number of spells with mana value X or less from among them without paying their mana costs. Through this sorcery, the top X cards of an opponent's library become an extension of our own hand for a turn, and easily could lead to a round of good games from our opponents. Lastly, in this section, we have a couple of sorceries that are considered game enders in Exsanguinate and Torment of Hailfire. With Exsanguinate, each opponent loses X life and we gain life equal to the life lost this way. Torment of Hailfire has each opponent repeat the following process X times. They lose 3 life unless they discard a card or sacrifice a non-land permanent. With enough mana, these spells can outright win us the game. Now it's time to reveal our X creature spells. Unsurprisingly, this section of the video will be dominated by Hydras. With so many Hydras from which to choose, we narrowed down our choices through this prioritization of evasive beatdown options and valuable utility effects. For evasive beatdown options, few rival Primordial Hydra. At the beginning of our upkeep, we double the number of +1/+1 counters on Primordial Hydra. It has trample as long as it has at least 10 +1/+1 counters. Next up on our beatdown list is Neverwinter Hydra. It has Ward 4, which means that whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, it is countered unless that player pays 4 mana. Whenever Neverwinter Hydra enters the battlefield, we roll X 6-sided dice. It comes into play with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the total of those results. Let's say we pay a total of 10 mana to cast Neverwinter Hydra, where X equals 4. In this scenario, when our Trampling Hydra with Ward 4 enters the battlefield, we roll 4 6-sided dice. We will put between 4 and 24 +1/+1 counters on it. If the standard +1/+1 counter delivery system for Hydras is 1 counter per 1 mana spent for X, then the odds are greatly in our favor of beating the established rate of return through our mana investment into Neverwinter Hydra. For some utility options, when Voracious Hydra enters the battlefield, we choose to double the number of +1/+1 counters on it, or it fights target creature we don't control. We can pay 2 and a green mana to remove a +1/+1 counter from Steelbane Hydra to destroy target artifact or enchantment. When we cast Hydroid Krasis, we gain half X life and draw half X cards. We round down each time. Let's not sleep on this Hydra's double evasion in the forms of flying and trample. There are few creatures that can contend with a juiced-up Hydroid Krasis in aerial combat. We have some Hydras with valuable death triggers as well. Vastwood Hydra allows us the option of distributing a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on it among any number of creatures we control. Hooded Hydra creates a 1/1 green insect creature token for each +1/+1 counter on it, while Lifeblood Hydra gains us life and draws us cards, both equal to its power. Our last X Hydra is Mistcutter Hydra. It cannot be countered, has haste, and has protection from blue. For all of the blue mages out there, and there's always at least one at every table, this Hydra's for you. Of course, not all of our X creatures are Hydras. Stonecoil Serpent has trample, reach, and protection from multicolored. It can be a stalwart defender or a threatening attacker. Altered Ego cannot be countered, and we may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature in play, except it enters with X additional +1/+1 counters on it. When Gadwick the Wizened enters the battlefield, we draw X cards, and whenever we cast a blue spell, we tap target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Note that Gadwick is the only X creature in this build that does not get +1/+1 counters put onto it after we cast it. Lastly, Walking Ballista can end the game on the spot. We can pay 4 mana and put a +1/+1 counter on it, and we can remove a +1/+1 counter from this construct to deal 1 point of damage to any target. Oodles and oodles of mana plus a Walking Ballista equals oodles and oodles of game-winning direct damage. Zaxara creates creature tokens that get +1/+1 counters. Nearly all of the X creature spells in this deck get +1/+1 counters. So let's enhance this +1/+1 counter sub-theme with a smattering of cards that synergize with this strategy. If one or more +1/+1 counters would be put onto a creature we control, Branching Evolution and Corpsejack Menace put twice that many +1/+1 counters on that creature instead. Doubling Season does the same, but extends its doubling effect to any counters put on permanents we control. Additionally, if an effect would create one or more tokens under our control, Doubling Season creates twice that many of those tokens instead. Note that Doubling Season synergizes with Zaxara's token creating ability and doubles the number of +1/+1 counters put onto them. Speaking of doubling +1/+1 counters, whenever Colonian Hydra attacks, we double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature we control. Whenever the creature equipped by Fractal Harness attacks, we double the number of +1/+1 counters on it. When this equipment enters the battlefield, we create a 0/0 green and blue Fractal creature token, put X +1/+1 counters onto it, and then attach Fractal Harness to it. For additional +1/+1 counter synergies, we have Retribution of the Ancients and Cynic Ascendancy. We can pay a black mana and remove X +1/+1 counters from among creatures we control to give target creature -X/-X until end of turn. Whenever we put one or more +1/+1 counters on a creature we control, we put that many growth counters on Cynic Ascendancy. At the beginning of our upkeep, if Cynic Ascendancy has at least 20 growth counters on it, then we win the game. We also can pay a green and a blue mana and put a +1/+1 counter on the target creature we control. Cynic Ascendancy provides another win condition in a build that has so many already. Our last card in this section of the video is the Ozolith. Whenever a creature we control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, then we put those counters onto the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on our turn, if the Ozolith has any counters on it, then we may move all counters from it and put them onto target creature. Note that these counters can be moved to any target creature, and not just ours. The Ozolith provides us the potential to one-shot an opponent, either by one of our creatures or by an opponent's. Let's close out this deck tech with some cards that synergize with and further enhance our theme. Since we have black in our deck, we can play with the two best tutors in the game in Demonic Tutor and Vampiric Tutor. Demonic Tutor puts any card from our library into our hand, while Vampiric Tutor searches our library for any card, we shuffle, and then we put that card on top of it. We lose 2 life in the process. Best tutors in the game. For the purposes of keeping the cards flowing into our hand, we have Garruk's Uprising and Rhystic Study. Garruk's Uprising gives creatures we control trample. This trample enablement makes the creature tokens created by Zaxara even more threatening. When Garruk's Uprising comes into play, we draw a card if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. Also, whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under our control, we draw a card. Rhystic Study taxes each opponent's spells by 1 mana, and if they fail to pay it, then we draw a card. Our opponents will be more annoyed by our incessant questioning of, "Are you going to pay 1 for that?" Lightning Greaves gives equipped creature haste and shroud. This equipment protects Zaxara from spot removal, and its haste enablement allows us to tap Zaxara for mana the turn our general comes into play. For wide-reaching protection, Asceticism gives all creatures we control hexproof, and we can pay 1 and a green mana to regenerate target creature. It is likely that our opponents will have forgotten about an old-school mechanic like regenerate, but not us. Attaching Pemin's Aura to Zaxara provides the potential to create infinite colored mana. Here's how. We tap Zaxara to add 2 blue mana. We use 1 of this blue mana to pay Pemin's Aura's untap ability. We rinse, we lather, we repeat. We use this infinite mana to cast any number of our X spells and win the game. We also can pay a blue mana to give enchanted creature flying until end of turn, shroud until end of turn, or pay a generic mana to give enchanted creature either +1/-1 or -1/+1 until end of turn. Krufix, God of Horizons, is an indestructible enchantment creature that is only a creature if our devotion to green and blue is at least 7. To factor our devotion here, we count the number of green and blue mana symbols and the casting costs of permanents we control. Krufix gives us no maximum hand size, and if we would lose unspent mana, that mana becomes colorless instead. Krufix provides a place to store mana for the purposes of maximizing the impact of our X spells. Paradox Zone enters the battlefield with a growth counter on it. At the beginning of our end step, we double the number of growth counters on Paradox Zone. Then, we create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, and we put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of growth counters on Paradox Zone. Casting this enchantment during the early portion of a game could yield game-winning results, particularly when paid with any of our aforementioned token and or +1/+1 counter synergies. For a little graveyard interaction, we can pay X and tap Sequence Engine to exile target creature card with mana value X from a graveyard. We create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token and then put X +1/+1 counters on it. We can activate this ability only as a sorcery. The last line of text sours the total sweetness that this artifact could have, but it is still a worthy inclusion in this build, particularly when trying to manage the graveyard shenanigans of our opponents. Primeval Bounty fits the theme of this deck perfectly. Whenever we cast a creature spell, we create a 3/3 green beast creature token. Whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature we control. Lastly, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we gain 3 life. This enchantment creates creature tokens, it doles out +1/+1 counters, and it provides peripheral life gain by engaging in the basic fundamental aspect of playing lands. We can pay 2 mana and tap Strionic Resonator to copy target triggered ability we control. We may choose new targets for the copy. This artifact can copy Zaxara's creature token producing ability and gives us 2 Hydra tokens for the cost of 1 X spell. Lastly, card number 99 of this deck tech is Unbound Flourishing. Whenever we cast a permanent spell with a mana cost that contains X, we double the value of X. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell or activate an ability, if that spell's mana cost or that ability's activation cost contains X, then we copy that spell or ability and we may choose new targets for the copy. When Unbound Flourishing is paired with Zaxara, we have the cogs to an immensely powerful value engine. With these 2 cards on our side of the battlefield, each time we cast a Hydra spell with X in its cost, X is doubled. Each time we cast an instant or sorcery spell with X in its cost, we copy the spell. We double the value of X for our permanents, and we double our instant and sorcery spells. Note that Zaxara will create just 1 Hydra token when any instant or sorcery spells are copied by Unbound Flourishing, because these copied spells are not being cast. Even with this minute limitation, Unbound Flourishing is card number 1 to add into any Zaxara the Exemplary build, and hopefully our opponents will not limit the number of Magic games they play with us in the future as a result. This Zaxara the Exemplary build has been added to the Burgeoning Commander Catalog, and this video also becomes the starting point of a Zaxara the Exemplary EDH deck video primer series. These playlist series can be accessed in the description below, on our YouTube page, or at the end of this video. The Burgeoning Commander Catalog is my personal collection of EDH decks. An EDH deck video primer series showcases the continued evolution of a deck through future appearances on the Up and Up series, during which we update and upgrade decks featured on this channel. The full card list for this build can be found in the description, and be sure to share your thoughts about this Zaxara the Exemplary deck in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your your channel for all things Magic.